These are the sounds of days that are past. We record a new dimension of history, a scrapbook of sounds from 13 years of violence and achievement, part of the greatest mass adventure man has yet undertaken. A voice can cut through the hazy fog of time and bring yesterday's images sharply into focus. Do you recognize this voice?
We'll hold the distinction of being the only nation in the history of the world that ever went to the poorhouse in an automobile.
That was the voice of Will Rogers, trying to teach America how to laugh its way through a depression. 1933 was dark all over the world. Japan was already in Manchuria, and the League of Nations was dying in Geneva. In Germany, the Reichstag fire was history. So was the Weimar Republic. In Italy, Benito Mussolini had translated a people's search for security into savage conquest. In rich, fertile America, fear and uncertainty lay heavy upon the land.
Our greatest primary task is to put people to work.
Franklin D. Roosevelt stood beside Chief Justice Hughes on the steps of the Capitol on that raw afternoon of March 4th, and a nation with 15 million unemployed listened.
So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed effort to convert retreat into advance.
The first year of the New Deal was vigorous, desperate, experimental, and like a surgeon's most powerful drugs, dangerous. Franklin Roosevelt and his corps of political practitioners, Hopkins, Tugwell, Moley, Wallace, and Hugh Johnson, created the most controversial administration since Lincoln's. And yet, either because of it or in spite of it, the patient revived and prospered. Production and employment were up. The soup kitchens and the apple stands disappeared. But a nervous America was still not sufficiently removed from panic to disregard completely the promises and plans of political soothsayers such as Townsend, Coghlan, and Huey Long.
The bank accounts show that 1/150th part of the people own 2/3 of all the money that's in the bank. The only way by which we can ever bring this country out is to redistribute the wealth.
1936 was the year in which the state of New Jersey electrocuted Bruno Richard Hauptmann for the Lindbergh kidnapping. It was also a presidential election year. But the biggest news story was in London and concerned political intrigue, an empire, a Baltimore beauty, and the King of England. On the night of December 11th, as Big Ben tolled the hour, London cinemas were deserted, New York subways empty at their usual rush hour. In Eugene, Oregon, and Johannesburg, you could hear the world quiet down.
This is Windsor Castle, His Royal Highness Prince Edward.
At long last, I am able to say a few words of my own. I have never wanted to withhold anything. But until now, it has not been constitutionally possible for me to speak. But you must believe me when I tell you that I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love. And now we all have the new king. I wish him and you, his people, happiness and prosperity with all my heart. God bless you all. God save the king.
With the exception of the president, no one in American politics receives a larger paycheck than the mayor of the city of New York. From 1934 to 46, with the exception of the president, no one in American politics made more news than the irrepressible mayor of the city of New York. Fiorello H. LaGuardia.
Yes, I have the proof that my kind of city government is the kind of city government the people of our city want. Isn't it grand? There isn't a single solitary county chairman of either party who is in favor of my administration. To use a phrase that Al Smith liked to use in his days, I can run on a laundry ticket and beat these political bums anytime.
By the summer of 36, time was running out on the New Deal's first term. Now the honeymoon was over. Vital segments of the once strongly pro-New Deal press asked for an end to the pump priming and supported the Republican nominee, Governor Alf Landon. Some called him a Kansas Coolidge.
I believe that a man can be a liberal without being a spendthrift.
At Franklin Field in Philadelphia, to the cheers of more than 100,000 supporters, Franklin D. Roosevelt accepted his party's second call and began a political campaign that was to win him every state but two.
To some generations, much is given. Of other generations, much is expected. This generation of Americans has a rendezvous with destiny.
American labor had made many a long stride under the New Deal and was now big business. Its leaders, the Greens, the Lewises, the Hillmans, were, like their counterparts in management, major political powers. By 1935, John Llewellyn Lewis had increased the membership of his United Mine Workers to almost 500,000, had bolted the AFL and formed the CIO. And on Labor Day of 37, he laid the lash of his biblical oratory upon FDR. It was the climax of a row which had been seething since the Little Steel strike of early spring, when the president had turned to Tom Girdler and Lewis and, in a rare moment of petulance, said, "A plague on both your houses." John Llewellyn Lewis answered,
"Labor, like Israel, has many sorrows. Its women weep for their fallen, and they lament for the future of the children of the race. It ill behooves one who has supped at labor's table and who has been sheltered in labor's house to curse with equal fervor and fine impartiality both labor and its adversaries when they become locked in deadly embrace."
The air age was upon us. The dirigible Hindenburg was crossing the Atlantic in less than 48 hours. Pan American was flying San Francisco to Manila and Hong Kong on a timetable. But the remarkable air achievement was not without its price. Flyers like Ed Music, Wiley Post, and Amelia Earhart Putnam paid the price for progress.
We take you now to Lakehurst, New Jersey.
It was drizzling that April night at Lakehurst as announcer Herb Morrison stood beside a WLS sound truck to describe the arrival of the dirigible Hindenburg.
The ship is riding majestically toward us like some great feather. And these giant flagships standing here, the American airline flagships, waiting to rise them to all points in the United States when they get the ship moored. It's practically standing still now. They've dropped ropes out of the nose of the ship. The rain had slacked up a little bit. The back motors of the ship are just holding it just enough to keep it from... It bursts into flames. Get it started, get it started. It's crashing. It's crashing terrible. Oh, my, get out of the way, please. It's bursting into flames and it's falling on the mooring mast and all the folks between it. This is terrible. This is one of the worst catastrophes in the world. Oh, it's like 400 or 500 feet into the sky. It's a terrific crash, ladies and gentlemen. It's smoke and it's flames now, and the frame is crashing to the ground, not quite to the mooring mast. All the humanity and all the tragedy.
This is Munich, Germany calling. The last 11th hour attempt to save the peace of Europe and avert a world war over the Sudeten muddle has just begun here in Munich.
1938 was the year of crisis. That's William L. Shirer's familiar voice.
Signor Mussolini, Mr. Daladier, and Mr. Chamberlain are meeting in the Führerbau, or the Führer's headquarters.
To the people of Czechoslovakia, 1938 was a poised knife. To Londoners, it was the digging of slit trenches and a Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, who said,
"How horrible, fantastic, incredible it is that we should be digging trenches and trying on gas masks here because of a quarrel in a faraway country between people of whom we know nothing."
Ich habe in diesen Jahren wirklich eine praktische Friedenspolitik betrieben. Ich bin an alle die scheinbar unmöglichen...
In America that September, it was waking up mornings to hear Nazi cheers and a Führer's rantings. Its animal-like hysteria caricatured by the filtering of the shortwave. For 20 years, he said, German people in Czechoslovakia had to be traitors to their own cause because they were defenseless against Herr Beneš's persecutions. Either Beneš will accept my offer and give the Germans in the Sudetenland freedom, or we will take it.
Wieder 2000 später 41.000, dann 62.000, dann 78.000, jetzt sind es 90.000, 107.000, 137.000 und heute 214.000.
Czech freedom was swapped for what Mr. Chamberlain called peace in our time.
Tomorrow, Parliament is going to meet, and I shall be making a full statement of the events which have led up to the present anxious and critical situation. And first of all, I must say something to those who have written to my wife or myself in these last weeks to tell us of their gratitude for my efforts and to assure us of their prayers for my success. After my visits to Germany, I realized vividly how Herr Hitler feels that he must champion other Germans. He told me privately, and last night he repeated publicly, that after this Sudeten German question is settled, that is the end of Germany's territorial claims in Europe.
Weighing 193, wearing purple trunks, outstanding contender for heavyweight honors, the former heavyweight title holder, Max Schmeling.
The only defeat the Nazis suffered that year was 3,500 miles west of the Sportspalast at the Yankee Stadium. An American Negro who wouldn't believe he was champion until he had conquered the only man who had ever beaten him.
World's heavyweight champion, Joe Louis.
Joe Louis versus Max Schmeling. The well-known voice of NBC's Clem McCarthy.
Right and left to the head, a left to the jaw, a right to the head, and Donovan is watching carefully. Lewis measures him, right to the body, a left hook to the jaw, and Schmeling is down. The count is 5, 6, 7, 8. The men are in the ring. The fight is over on a technical knockout. Max Schmeling is beaten in 1 round.
Yankee Stadium has had many other great moments, but none quite so moving as that when Iron Man Lou Gehrig stepped down after 2,130 consecutive games.
I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth. That I might have been given a bad break, but I've got an awful lot to live for. Thank you.
Great Britain went to war against Germany today, 25 years and 30 days from the time she entered the War of 1914 against the same enemy. France is expected to follow suit within the next few hours. The state of war came into existence
on September 3rd, 1939. A Labor Day America heard the calm Midwestern accents of Elmer Davis tell them that the 20-year armistice was ended. Poland was first.
Warszawo, z tobą zwycięstwo albo śmierć.
Poland fell in exactly 26 days. Russia attacked Poland from the east, and that December struck Finland from the south. World's fairs closed for the season at Flushing Meadows and the Golden Gate, and the phony war opened for the season along the Maginot Line. Although a Paderewski concert for Polish relief could fill Carnegie Hall, America First rallies were packing Madison Square Garden. Lindbergh gave them the word.
These wars in Europe are not wars in which our civilization is defending itself against some Asiatic intruder. There is no Genghis Khan or Xerxes marching against our Western nations. This is simply one more of those age-old struggles within our own family of nations. If we enter fighting for democracy abroad, we may end by losing it at home.
That was Charles A. Lindbergh, the most idolized personality of the Roaring Twenties, who, like Wheeler, Nye, Fish, and the others, fought the administration's attempt to repeal the Embargo Act. There were others who thought differently and supported the president and the good gray judge, Mr. Secretary Hull. Among them, Stimson, Baruch, and Al Smith.
Personally, I am not interested in the argument as to whether or not we should return to so-called established principles of international law. I am not a student of law, but I'm ready to defend the proposition that there is no respect for international law at this time.
General Hugh Johnson, once the most powerful lieutenant in the New Deal, now one of its severest critics, said we were shooting craps with destiny.
We are being bums rushed toward a fateful choice between immediate involvement in war by our own warlike acts or keeping out of war as long as we can. We are utterly, tragically unready for war or defense today. Many recent acts of ours are acts of war. They are a sort of reckless shooting craps with destiny for the stake of democracy.
In the spring, the phony war was ended, and the world's glossary was extended to include Stuka, Panzer, Messerschmitt, Rommel, von Rundstedt, and Deutschland. The Blitzkrieg struck in the north. Denmark fell in 4 hours.
Tyskerne I Oslo, men Norge vil fortsette kampen.
Oslo in a day, Norway in 32. Quisling became a common noun.
Nederland zal herrijzen.
Wilhelmina's Holland overwhelmed in 5 days.
Debout, Belgique. Défends ton sol.
Leopold gave up the Flanders pocket after 18 days. June 4th, another kind of noun. Dunkirk, that will live as long as the English language. With 7 Nazi columns cutting deep into France, the Duce reached a decision.
On this 10th day of June, 1940, the hand that held the dagger has struck it into the back of its neighbor.
For on that 10th day of June, Benito Mussolini, already bulging with Ethiopia and Albania, declared war on France.
Decisioni irrevocabili. La dichiarazione di guerra è già stata consegnata agli ambasciatori. Popolo italiano, corri alle armi e dimostra la tua tenacia.
C'est en ce moment précis, alors que la France blessée, mais vaillante et debout,
A desperate Premier Paul Reynaud, with the Nazis flooding into Paris, hammering France into submission, turned to America and promised that France would fight on if our president would send help. Our generals, he said, are commanding battalions. Send us waves of planes and we shall hurl back the invader.
En même temps qu'au sentiment de la solidarité humaine. La France a traversé de plus rudes épreuves. C'est alors qu'elle a toujours étonné le monde. La France ne peut pas mourir.
France will never die. That's the Nazi band that Paul Goebbels rushed to the famous railroad carriage in the forest at Compiègne. Here, where the Franco-Prussian War ended in 1872, here across the same table where Marshal Foch humbled the Kaiser's generals in 1918, Adolf Hitler had his revenge in a humiliating French surrender.
Achtung, hier ist der Großdeutsche Rundfunk. Sie hören jetzt die soeben eingetroffenen ersten Rundfunkberichte vom Beginn der Verhandlungen über den Waffenstillstand mit Frankreich im Walde von Compiègne.
After the disaster in Norway, Britain's House of Commons held a post-mortem, which raged for 2 days and 2 nights. Jeers and insults flew like shrapnel across the room, and at the end of it all, Neville Chamberlain walked out alone, a beaten, broken man.
It was clear that at this critical moment in the war, what was needed was the formation of a government which would include members of the Labour and Liberal oppositions. His Majesty has now entrusted to my friend and colleague, Mr. Winston Churchill, the task of forming a new administration on a national basis.
I speak to you for the first time as Prime Minister in a solemn hour for the life of our country, of our empire, of our allies, and above all, of the cause of freedom.
Winston Churchill offered nothing but blood, tears, sweat, and toil. For years, he sat in the House of Commons like the conscience of England, his warnings ignored, as the big clock above the Speaker's chair ticked off the wasted hours. Now the hour had come for him to mobilize the English language and send it into battle, a spearhead of hope for Britain and the world. We have joined together some of that Churchillian prose. It sustained, it lifted the hearts of an island people when they stood alone.
Behind the armies and fleets of Britain and France gather a group of shattered states and bludgeoned races, the Czechs, the Poles, the Norwegians, the Danes, the Dutch, the Belgians, upon all of whom the long night of barbarism will descend, unbroken even by a star of hope, unless we conquer. As conquer we must, as conquer we shall.
June 18th. I can hear it now.
What General Weygand has called the Battle of France is over. The Battle of Britain is about to begin. Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island or lose the war. Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duty, and so bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its commonwealths last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour.
And from a bombed building in a burned-out city, where the bombers came at dusk and departed at dawn, came the voices of 2 princesses, Elizabeth and Margaret Rose, sending greetings to evacuated children.
My sister is by my side, and we are both going to say good night to you. Come on, Margaret. Good night, children. Good night, and good luck to you all.
"48 days before the Republicans moved into Philadelphia's Convention Hall to select their candidate for 1940, he was a wealthy corporation lawyer, a political unknown, who had been a Democrat for all but 4 years of his life. But by the dawn of June 28th, an army of political amateurs had incited a GOP rebellion. And Wendell L. Willkie had knocked the Taft, Dewey, Vandenberg campaigns into a cocked hat. As Chairman Joe Martin put it,
out of the hearts of these patriotic Americans came the chant, "We want Willkie."
Willkie's hulking Midwestern frame, his shock of rumpled hair, his big gesturing hands were seen by millions of voters in 51 days and 18,000 miles of the most vigorous campaigning since Teddy Roosevelt. At Elwood, 200,000 fellow Hoosiers heard that hoarse yet vibrant voice accept the nomination.
And I would also like to debate the question of the assumption by this president in seeking a 3rd term of a greater public confidence than was accorded to our presidential giants, Washington, Jefferson, Jackson, Lincoln, Theodore Roosevelt, and Woodrow Wilson. I accept the nomination of the Republican Party for President on stage. But I say this too. In the pursuit of that goal, I shall not lead you down the easy road. I shall lead you down the road of sacrifice and of service to your country.
More Americans cast their ballot for Wilkie than for any Republican candidate in history. 22 million. But he was stacked up against the most successful vote-getter of them all.
I've had a glorious day here in New England.
During this campaign, FDR coined one of his favorite slogans.
I still remember, he is one of that great historic trio which has voted consistently against every measure for the relief of agriculture, modern, barn, and fish.
Adolf Hitler held the continent. Britain braced itself, endured its ordeal by fire and blast. And new hope came from the New World.
We must be the great arsenal of democracy. For us, this is an emergency as serious as war itself.
And when Wilkie went abroad to see for himself, he carried a message to Churchill.
The other day, President Roosevelt gave his opponent in the late presidential election a letter of introduction to me. And in it he wrote out a verse in his own handwriting from Longfellow. Sail on, O ship of state. Sail on, O Union strong and great. Humanity with all its fears, with all the hopes of future years, is hanging breathless on thy fate. What is the answer that I shall give in your name to this great man? Give us the tools, and we will finish the job.
Now there was an embargo on scrap iron shipments to Japan. A month later, Lend-Lease was law. And 9 months later, the Atlantic Charter was born off the Newfoundland banks. Where were you on the afternoon of December 7th, 1941? If your name is Michel Piastro, you were at Carnegie Hall tightening the strings of your violin for the Sunday afternoon performance. If you were Gerald Nye, you were addressing 2,200 America Firsters in Pittsburgh. If your name is Saburo Caruso, you were waiting in the outer office of Cordell Hull. If you were a sailor named Tomish at a place called Pearl Harbor, you and 2,116 of your buddies will be dead when the day is done.
We interrupt this program to bring you a special news bulletin. The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, by air, President Roosevelt has just announced. The attack also was made on all naval and military activities on the principal island of Oahu.
The President of the United States.
If your name is Sam Rayburn, you lift your gavel and rap for order as a joint session of senators and representatives, many of them bitter foes of the man on the rostrum, cheer him madly because, like most Americans, they are angry, frightened, and confused. And he is the President of the United States.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The attack yesterday on the Hawaiian Islands has caused severe damage to American naval and military forces. I regret to tell you that very many American lives have been lost. With confidence in our armed forces, with the unbounding determination of our people, we will gain the inevitable triumph, so help us God.
If you were in Manila that night or in Singapore or London, you know the terror of that sound. You know it can never be imitated. It is the shimmering wail of 100 sirens bouncing off the echo chambers, which are a bombed city's dead buildings and deserted docks. If you were on Bataan that night, or the Burma Road 3 months later, or Guadalcanal a year later, you know that when a howitzer shell explodes, the jungle screams back. From Rayburn's gavel to the warning signal of the D-Day Armada, our glossary of war words reached round the globe and back again. Corregidor and Sevastopol, Strobing and Wainwright and HMS Prince of Wales, Sidi Barrani and the Irrawaddy, Archangel and Bizerta and the Macassar Straits, Flak Happy, Radar, Spitfire, the Bazooka and the Molotov cocktail, Schweinfurt, Ploesti, Dieppe, Ascension, the Kasserine Pass, and Hill 609, M1, JU-88, APO-885, OSS, and Jig Easy Sugar Queen, the Pripet Marshes, the Lido Road, the Slat, the Hump, the Repel Depots, the Piccadilly Commandos, and a beach called Anzio, the Memphis Belle, Geronimo, Wild Bull, the Fighting Lady, and the ceremonious pealing of Big Ben. The discordant bong of our little Liberty Bell on D-Day.
This is Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force.
And a man from Kansas with a message half the world had prayed for.
General Dwight D. Eisenhower.
People of Western Europe. A landing was made this morning on the coast of France by troops of the Allied Expeditionary Force. This landing is part of the concerted United Nations plan for the liberation of Europe, made in conjunction with our great Russian allies.
The liberation, like the message that signaled it, came in many tongues. The French of Charles de Gaulle.
La bataille suprême est engagée. Après tant de combats, de fureur, de douleur, voici venu le choc décisif.
And a Polish foreign minister in exile.
Żołnierze, lotnicy, marynarze Polacy. Wkraczamy w decydującą fazę generalnej rozgrywki i porachunku z Niemcami.
Those who were there say King Haakon wept as he spoke to Norway.
Landsmenn, som led i den store strategiske plan, som har taget sigte på frigøring av Europas undertrykte folk.
There were messages from the Dutch, the Danes, the Luxembourgers, and the Belgians.
Mes chers compatriotes, les opérations préliminaires pour la libération de l'Europe ont commencé.
I call upon all who love freedom to stand with us now. Together we shall achieve victory.
Because D-Day was the most important day of the war, and very possibly of our generation, some of the broadcasts of those first 24 hours achieved a special kind of permanence. One of these originated on the headquarters ship Ancon, just off the French coast. Your reporter, George Hicks of the ABC.
Our own ship has just gave its warning whistles, and now the flak is coming up in the sky. Looks like we're going to have a night tonight. Give us a boys! Another one coming over. And a cruiser right alongside of it, pouring it up. Something burning is falling down through the sky. And circling down, maybe a hit plane. They got one.
The history of wars does not know of any undertaking so broad in concept and so grandiose in its scale and masterful in its execution. Those words about the invasion of the continent were spoken by Joseph Stalin.
Приходится праздновать сегодня 24-ю годовщину Октябрьской революции. Вероломные нападения
You are listening to one of the rare recorded speeches of Marshal Stalin.
и навязанная нам война создали угрозу для нашей страны.
Comrades, today we celebrate the 24th anniversary of the October Revolution in difficult times.
У ворот Ленинграда и Москвы. На вас смотрит
The enemy is even now before the gates of Leningrad and Moscow.
уничтожить разбойничьи орды немецких захватчиков.
Long live our glorious motherland. Under the banner of Lenin, onward to victory.
Здравствует наша славная Родина, ее свобода, ее независимость. Под знаменем Ленина вперед к победе!
The Soviet Union, invaded by Hitler in June of 41, fought where it could, retreated, scorched its earth, held the line from Lake Ladoga to the Black Sea, and in so doing won the respect of the world. By the summer of 44, the Ukrainian Fourth Army was in the Carpathians, the American First 5 miles inside Germany, the British Second in Holland at Arnhem, the Marines, the Army, and the Seabees in the Marianas. And by October, the American Sixth was back in the Philippines. At home, people worked and waited and watched the political battle.
These Republican leaders have not been content with attacks on me or on my wife or on my sons. No, not content with that. They now include my little dog, Fowler.
Franklin Roosevelt versus Thomas Dewey.
This is a campaign against an administration which was conceived in defeatism, which failed for 8 straight years to restore our domestic economy, which has been the most wasteful, extravagant, and incompetent administration in the history of the nation, and worst of all, one which has lost faith in itself and in the American people.
On the 20th day of January, 45, Franklin Roosevelt took his 4th oath of office. Bastogne and the Bulls were history now. MacArthur was ashore at Luzon on Lingayen Gulf and striking for Manila. And the Marines were studying terrain maps of a place called Iwo Jima. Early that March, the President, visibly weary, went before the Congress to report on Yalta.
I hope that you will pardon me for an unusual posture of sitting down during the presentation of what I want to say. But I know that you will realize that it makes it a lot easier for me in not having to carry about 10 pounds of steel around on the bottom of my legs, and also because of the fact that I have just completed a 14,000-mile trip. Speaking in all frankness, the question of whether it is entirely fruitful lies to a great extent in your hands.
We interrupt this program for a special news bulletin. That's radio's way of shouting extra, as John Daly did late that April afternoon.
Wilderness Road. Adventure on the American frontier with the Weston family and Daniel Boone in the exciting days following the American Revolution.
We interrupt this program to bring you a special news bulletin from CBS World News. A press association has just announced that President Roosevelt is dead. The president died of a cerebral hemorrhage. All we know so far is that the president died at Warm Springs in Georgia.
If you were one of those who loved FDR, and there were many, or if you were one of those who hated him, and there were many, that flash from Warm Springs was as personal as a body blow or a wire from the War Department. Without warning, the central pivot had slipped out of a 12-year era, and you were stunned by this sudden cleavage of time. He had gone down Pennsylvania Avenue many times before. This was his last trip to the White House. A city watched, a nation listened. Arthur Godfrey, an old Washington hand, described it.
The drums are wrapped in black crepe and are muffled, as you can hear. And the pace of the musicians is so slow. And behind them, these are Navy boys. And now just coming past the Treasury, I can see the horses drawing the caisson. And most generally, folks having as tough a time as I am trying to see it. And behind us is the car bearing the men on whose shoulders now falls the terrific burdens and responsibilities that were handled so well by the man to whose body we're paying our last respects now. God bless him, President Truman. We return you now to the studio.
One of FDR's most fitting epitaphs was written before he died by a Kansas Republican, William Allen White. Biting good Republican nails, we are compelled to say that Franklin Roosevelt is the most unaccountable president the United States has ever seen. He has seen more of this amazing world than Marco Polo. Well, darn your smiling old picture, here it is. We who hate your gaudy guts salute you. Now, if you listen very closely, you will hear some unrehearsed stage whispers between Speaker Rayburn and the 32nd President.
Mr. Speaker.
Just a moment. Let me present you, will you, Harry?
Members of the Congress, I have the great pleasure and the high privilege of presenting to you the President of the United States.
There was another burst of applause and cheers, and then Americans settled back to listen to their new president.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. President, members of the Congress, it is with a heavy heart that I stand before you, my friends and colleagues in the Congress of the United States. Within an hour after I took the oath of office, I announced that the San Francisco Conference would proceed. In the memory of those who have made the supreme sacrifice, in the memory of our fallen president, we shall not fail.
13 days later, Secretary of State Edward Stettinius stepped before the delegates of 46 nations.
The Conference of the United Nations on International Organization is now convened. We shall open the conference with 1 minute of silent and solemn meditation.
On May 8th, President Truman announced that another promise had been kept.
I only wish that Franklin D. Roosevelt had lived to witness this day. General Eisenhower informs me that the forces of Germany have surrendered to the United Nations. The flags of freedom fly all over Europe.
In the days just prior to VE Day, Allied divisions in Germany began meeting the most extreme victims of fascism. Out of death factories, there began to emerge the living, stumbling ghosts of Buchenwald, Dachau, and Belsen. And a new set of initials joined our language, DPs. Albert Einstein, German refugee, class of 33, Enrico Fermi, Italian exile, class of 38, might well have been among them, and we might have lost the Battle of the Atomic Scientists, which had its climax on the island of Tinian on August 6th, 45. Now you are at the world's largest airfield on Tinian in the Marianas. The voice you hear is that of Chaplain William Downey, who stood amongst the target charts, the escape kits, and the stale coffee, and said a prayer for the Enola Gay and civilization.
We pray thee that the end of the war may come soon, and that once more we may know peace on earth. May the men who fly this night be kept safe in thy care, and may they be returned safely to us. We shall go forward, trusting in thee, knowing that we are in thy care now and forever. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen.
The bomb run lasted 4 minutes. The bomb went away at 9:15. My God was the only entry in the co-pilot's diary. 78,150 people died at Hiroshima.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
The world will note that the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, a military base. We won the race of discovery against the Germans. We have used it in order to shorten the agony of war, in order to save the lives of thousands and thousands of young Americans. We shall continue to use it until we completely destroy Japan's power to make war.
7 p.m. Eastern Wartime. Bob Trout reporting. The Japanese have accepted our terms fully. That's the word we've just received from the White House in Washington. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of the Second World War. The United Nations, on land, on the sea, in the air, and to the four corners of the earth, are united and are victorious. We got that information on a special line from the White House, and now it's beginning to come in on the wire services, too. President Truman announced it at 7 p.m. tonight, just a minute ago, and now a flash, MacArthur appointed Jap boss over the Emperor of Japan.
Where were you on September 2nd, 1945? If you were Jonathan Wainwright, you were on the crowded, heavy decks of the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay, listening to an old comrade call your name.
Will General Wainwright and General Percival step forward and accompany me while I sign?
If your name was Douglas MacArthur, you have kept a date made 3,000 miles and 4 years ago.
Let us pray that peace be now restored to the world and that God will preserve it always. These proceedings are closed.
At the historic instant when the first atomic bomb seemed to charge out of the bowels of the earth, Professor George Kistiakowsky remarked, "I am sure that on doomsday, in the last millisecond, the last man on earth will see what we have just seen." In direct contrast, William Lawrence of the New York Times felt as though he were present at the dawn of creation when the Lord said, "Let there be light." If the universe is as many millions years old as we think it is, our crowded little era of 13 years is but an instant of yesterday when it is past. 1933's unemployment, September at Munich, that June 10th at Lidice, December 7th at Pearl Harbor, 9/15 over Hiroshima, were all part of the identical moment. The one question remaining then, was it 23:59 o'clock or 00:01? Was there to be still another cycle of affliction, appeasement, and annihilation? Or had we walked through midnight towards the dawn without knowing it?
London, February 24th, 1946.
I first came to England 16 years ago, in the summertime. It rained for 2 weeks. Being just out of the university, I wore a straw boater and carried a cane. No one laughed at me, at least not openly. The boater did not survive the rigors of the English summer. The cane was jettisoned during the crossing from Dover to Ostend. I saw little of England, nothing of Scotland. What I did see did not impress me. During the next 7 years, I was 3 times in England, always for a brief visit. I am Irish, French, English, and German, a mixture that is not uncommon in my country. I knew something of your history and more of your literature, but to me, England was a small, pleasant, historical, but relatively unimportant island off the coast of Europe. It was different, and therefore interesting. Your country was a sort of museum piece, pleasant, but small. You seemed slow, indifferent, and exceedingly complacent, not important. I thought your streets narrow and mean, your tailors over-advertised, your climate unbearable, your class consciousness offensive. You couldn't cook. Your young men seemed without vigor or purpose. I admired your history, doubted your future, and suspected that the historians had merely agreed upon a myth. But always there was something that escaped me. Always there remained in the back of a youthful and undisciplined mind the suspicion that I might be wrong. About 9 years ago, being persuaded that war was inevitable, I came here to live. Now I am going home, and the BBC have asked this reporter to remember. This might go on for a week, but I must try to speak of those things that are riveted upon my memory, not because they are important or profound, but because they represent things of great value which I shall be taking back with me.
London, August 31st, 1939.
It has been decided to start evacuation of school children and other priority classes as already arranged under the government scheme. Tomorrow, Friday, September 1st. No one should conclude that this decision means that a war is being regarded as inevitable. The scheme applies to the following classes: children, younger children accompanied by their mothers or other responsible persons, mothers, blind persons, and cripples whose removal is feasible. The plans are all ready for operation, and have been well rehearsed. If you live in one of the areas mentioned and have a child of school age and wish to have him evacuated, you should send him to school tomorrow, Friday, with hand luggage containing the child's gas mask, a change of underclothing, night clothes, house shoes, spare stockings or socks, a toothbrush, a comb, towel, soap, face cloth, handkerchief, and if possible, a warm coat or mackintosh, a packet of food for the day. School children will be taken by their teachers to homes in safer districts, where they will be housed by people who have already offered to receive them and look after them. All parents of school children are strongly urged to let their children go. Parents will be told where their children are as soon as they reach their new homes. Mothers and other persons in charge of children below school age should take hand luggage with the same equipment for themselves as their children. As for school children, the names of the children should be written on strong paper and sewn onto their clothes. No one can take more than a little hand luggage. Those who can should take with them sufficient money to tide them over until they can get regular remittances from home. But no one should refrain from going merely because of difficulties in regard to money, as arrangements will be made to look after those who are in need. It's useless to speculate concerning the reasons for this move in London today. You will remember that it was strongly advocated in the House of Commons on Tuesday. At that time, the government declined to act. Today, it seems, they feel unable longer to assume the responsibility for keeping children and other categories in London.
September 3rd, 1939.
This is London calling Columbia and New York. Now first, let's get in proper order the chronological developments of the day. At 9 o'clock this morning, London time, it was announced that a 2-hour ultimatum had been delivered to Germany, that at the end of that time, hostilities must cease, or Germany and Britain would be at war. At 11:15, the Prime Minister spoke to the nation. He stated that no reply had been received to the ultimatum, and that Britain and Germany were at war. Shortly after the Prime Minister's speech, the air raid sirens went off, and it wasn't a pleasant sound. We moved quietly and in orderly fashion down underground. The all clear came in just a little while. It seems that an unidentified plane had been seen approaching the coast. It was later found to be a friendly ship. Now, for the last few hours, I haven't had an opportunity to be up on the streets of London to see what is happening. But I have heard one story concerning that air raid siren, and I think that story might interest you. It's told me by a friend of mine who was in Bond Street. And he said, when the air raid siren went off, one man began to run. He ran for about half a block. He looked around, saw that no one else was running, and stopped, with perhaps the typical English desire not to be conspicuous.
September 4th, 1939.
For several days, I've reported or repeated to you calls for ambulance drivers, stretcher bearers, and other personnel of the civilian defense. It might be useful to request the services of a good sociologist, because if this business of repeated air raid alarms goes on, the sociological results will be considerable. This is a class-conscious country. People live in the same small street or apartment building for years and never talk to each other. The man with a fine car, good clothes, and perhaps an unearned income doesn't generally fraternize with the tradesmen, day laborers, and truck drivers. His fences are always up. He doesn't meet them as equals. He is surrounded with certain evidences of worldly wealth, calculated to keep others at a distance. But if he's caught in Piccadilly Circus when the sirens sound, he may have a waitress stepping on his heels and see before him the broad back of a day laborer as he goes underground. If the alarm sounds about 4 in the morning, as it did this morning, his dignity, reserve, and authority may suffer when he arrives half-dressed and sleepy, minus his usual defenses and possessed of no more courage than those others who have arrived in similar state. Someone, I think it was Marcus Aurelius, said something to the effect that death put Alexander of Macedon and his stable boy on a par. Repeated visits to public air raid shelters might have produced the same results. Maybe I'm wrong. I'm not a very good sociologist, but I can tell you this from personal experience. That siren would improve your knowledge of even your most intimate friend. London, as usual, is black tonight. One gets accustomed to it, but it can hardly be called pleasant. I don't know how you feel about people who smoke cigarettes, but I like them, particularly at night in London. That small, dull red glow is a very welcome sight. It prevents collisions and makes it unnecessary to heave to until you locate the exact position of those vague voices in the darkness. One night several years ago, I walked bang into a cow, and since then I've had a desire for man and beast to carry running lights on dark nights. They can't do that in London these nights, but cigarettes are a good substitute. For a moment tonight, I thought I was back in the London of Mr. Pickwick's time. I heard a voice booming through these dark London streets. It said, 28 Portland Place, all's well. It was an air raid warden. He'd shouted them an order to cover their window. They had done so, and so he was telling them that no more light came through.
November 27th, 1939.
The other afternoon, I spent several hours underground studying the central control station of London's air raid precaution system. One man can sit in that room and move ambulances, stretcher parties, gas decontamination squads, and repair parties, just as though he had them on the end of a string. The maps covering the walls resemble those in an army headquarters. The whole system is linked to local units by direct telephone, and if the telephones don't work, there are motorcycle dispatch riders standing by to carry messages. If London is bombed, one could sit in that room and by reading colored pins and discs on the maps, tell just where bridges have been blown up, where fire engines are needed, where additional ambulances are required, and the position of reserve units which might be needed. It was quiet down there the other day. The elaborate maps on which one could follow the approach of enemy aircraft were clear. The bright little pins, which mean gas or railroad destroyed or serious fire, were sitting in a little box like toy soldiers. The telephone operators, young girls who might have been college sophomores at home, sat at their instruments knitting or reading. One was reading the life of Madame Curie, another Tolstoy's War and Peace, and the latest detective thrillers were also in evidence. Occasionally, they practice a little. The telephone rings, the operator takes down a message, passes it through a slot to the control officer, and in a few minutes' time, an ambulance brigade or a covey of fire engines go racing through the streets in a remote part of London on a practice trip. The whole scheme seemed to be efficient and at the same time easy to operate. The Minister of Food will announce in the House of Commons tomorrow the date for the introduction of rationing in Britain. And it is reported from Oslo that the Norwegian Nobel Committee has reached a decision on its annual peace award. It has decided not to award a peace prize for 1939. I return you now to Columbia in New York.
April 9th, 1940.
I was in the House of Commons this afternoon, and it was a tense and expectant house. Members became a little impatient as the big clock above the Speaker's chair ticked off the minutes, while no less than 111 questions were answered by various cabinet ministers. Everyone wanted to hear the Prime Minister. When Mr. Chamberlain rose briskly to his feet, silence settled over the House. He began by quoting, almost with satisfaction, from his speech made at the end of the Finnish War, in which he predicted that the policy of Sweden and Norway would not in the end save them from aggression. The Prime Minister went on to say that the Allies were going to the assistance of Norway, and that heavy units of the fleet were now at sea. The speech was brief and added nothing to reports that had been published. The debate that followed, if it can be called a debate, was noisy and inconclusive. One member, suggesting that the matter should be referred to the League of Nations, was howled down. Another, wanting to advocate an immediate and complete change of government, was swamped by a wave of shouting and cries of order, order, and sit down. Still another backbencher wanted to make a speech about Japanese aggression in China. At least I think that's what he wanted to talk about. He had no chance at all. One question as to why the Germans were able to effect a landing on the north of Norway when British naval patrols were out, and when Britain claims control of the sea, met with a caustic reply from the Prime Minister. He suggested that the questioner restrain both his impatience and his criticism until the facts are known. The debate was brief. The House didn't want to talk about anything except the war against Germany, and there was nothing to be said about that after the Prime Minister's speech. Members were inclined to be bellicose and at times unruly. They clearly wanted a victory, not lengthy discussion. There was no drama in the Commons this afternoon, comparable with that involved in the announcement of Mr. Chamberlain's flight to Munich. No parliamentary leader attacked the government. The House approved overwhelmingly of the decision to aid Norway and appeared willing to wait for news as to just how that was going to be done. But there were many indications, both in the House and in the lobbies afterward, that Parliament expects prompt and decisive action. If it should be said of Norway, as it was of Finland, that Allied help was too little and too late, there would be changes in the political leadership of this country. One familiar figure was missing from the row of ministers occupying the government front bench this afternoon. Mr. Winston Churchill, the man whom many Britishers believe will win this war for them, was not there. He was busy elsewhere. And so, at 1 o'clock in the morning, London does not know what steps have been taken to assist Norway, does not know which of the many rumors of naval actions in the stormy waters of the North Sea off the coast of Norway should be believed. But the British are confident of their Navy and believe that Mr. Churchill will have good news for them before many hours have passed.
May 8th, 1940.
This is London. I spent today in the House of Commons. The debate was opened by Herbert Morrison, one of the ablest members of the Labour Party. He doubted that the government was taking the war seriously. As long as this government remained in power, there was risk of losing the war. Then, almost casually, Mr. Morrison said that the Labour Party had decided to divide the House. In other words, call for a vote. Mr. Chamberlain, white with anger, intervened in the debate and accepted the challenge. In fact, he welcomed it. He fairly spat the words at jeering Labour members on the opposite side of the House. The Prime Minister felt that the demand for a vote had made a serious situation worse. He asserted that now we shall know who is for us and who against us. He said that he had friends in the House, and he appealed to them to support him. Next came Sir Samuel Hoare, the Air Minister, with his defense of the Norwegian campaign. He was unconvincing. More than half of the House went out to tea while he was speaking. When he had finished, Mr. David Lloyd George rose and placed his notes upon the dispatch box. Through the lobbies and in the tea rooms ran the word, LG is up, and members surged into the room through both doors, as though the little square, gray-shouldered, white-haired Welshman were a magnet to draw them back to their seats. Lloyd George began easily in a tense atmosphere. He reoriented and reshaped the entire debate, which previously had dealt with details of the Norwegian campaign. He called for an end of this petty cash accounting. Hitler had placed his country in a stronger strategic position than it ever was in the last war. The government apparently failed to realize the danger. The Prime Minister has met Hitler in peace and in war, and has been beaten every time. Britain's promises to neutrals were now considered worthless. Much more was involved than just the Norwegian campaign. The whole prosecution of the war, victory or defeat, depended on the outcome. He traced the history of Czechoslovakia, Spain, Poland, and Norway, and he whipped off his gold-rimmed spectacles to pour scorn and condemnation upon the government front bench facing him 10 feet away. He swept the House with his arm and said, If there is a man here who is satisfied with our production of planes, of guns, of tanks, or the training of troops, let him stand on his feet. No one stood. Mr. Lloyd George reproached the Prime Minister for making a personal issue of the criticism which had been leveled against his government. He ended by saying that the Prime Minister could make his greatest contribution to victory by handing in his seals of office. In other words, resigning.
May 10th, 1940.
This is London. History has been made too fast over here today. First, in the early hours this morning, came the news of the British unopposed landing in Iceland. Then the news of Hitler's triple invasion came rolling into London, climaxed by the German air bombing of 5 nations. British mechanized troops rattled across the frontier into Belgium. Then, at 9 o'clock tonight, a tired old man spoke to the nation from number 10 Downing Street. He sat behind the big oval table in the cabinet room where so many fateful decisions have been taken during the 3 years that he has directed the policy of His Majesty's government. Neville Chamberlain announced his resignation. Mr. Chamberlain's announcement of his resignation was entirely impersonal. Many people consider that it was the best speech he has ever made. Winston Churchill, who has held more political offices than any living man, is now Prime Minister. He is a man without a party. For the last 7 years, he has sat in the House of Commons, a rather lonesome and often bellicose figure, voicing unheeded warnings of the rising tide of German military strength. Now, at the age of 65, Winston Churchill, plump, bald, with massive round shoulders, is for the first time in his varied career of journalist, historian, and politician, the Prime Minister of Great Britain. Mr. Churchill now takes over the supreme direction of Britain's war effort at a time when the war is rapidly moving toward Britain's doorstep. Mr. Churchill's critics have said that he is inclined to be impulsive and at times vindictive. But in the tradition of British politics, he will be given his chance. He will probably take chances, but if he brings victory, his place in history is assured. The historians will have to devote more than a footnote to this remarkable man, no matter what happens. He enters office with the tremendous advantage of being the man who was right. He also has the advantage of being the best broadcaster in this country. Mr. Churchill can inspire confidence, and he can preach a doctrine of hate that is acceptable to the majority of this country. That may be useful during these next few months. Winston Churchill has never been known for his caution, and when he has completed the formation of his new government, you may expect this country to begin to live dangerously. Hitler has said that the action begun yesterday will settle the future of Germany for 1,000 years. Mr. Churchill doesn't deal in such periods of time, but the decisions reached by this new Prime Minister with his boyish grin and his puckish sense of humor may well determine the outcome of this war. I return you now to Columbia in New York.
June 2nd, 1940.
This is London. The Allied rear guard is still holding Dunkirk against increasing German pressure. Heavy German field guns are pounding the beaches, and efforts to remove more men are continuing. According to Mr. Anthony Eden, more than 4/5 of the British Expeditionary Force has been evacuated. The Air Force claims at least 125 German planes shot down in the Dunkirk area during the last 2 days. Today's score is given as 35 Germans down and 8 British fighters lost. Yesterday, I spent several hours at what may be tonight or next week Britain's first line of defense, an airfield on the southeast coast. German bases weren't more than 10 minutes flying time away. Across that ditch that has protected Britain and conditioned the thinking of Britishers for centuries. I talked with pilots as they came back from Dunkirk. They stripped off their life jackets, glanced at a few bullet holes in wings or fuselage, and as the ground crews swarmed over the aircraft, refueling motors and guns, we sat on the ground and talked. Out in the middle of the field, the wreckage of a plane was being cleared up. It had crashed the night before. The pilot had been shot in the head, but had managed to get back to his field. The Royal Air Force prides itself on never walking out of a plane until it falls apart. I can tell you what those boys told me. They were the cream of the youth of Britain. As we sat there, they were waiting to take off again. They talked of their own work, discussed the German Air Force with all the casualness of Sunday morning quarterbacks discussing yesterday's football game. There were no nerves, no profanity, and no heroics. There was no swagger about those boys in wrinkled and stained uniforms. The movies do that sort of thing much more dramatically than it is in real life. They told me of the patrol from which they just returned. 6 Germans down. We lost 2. What happened to Eric, said one. Oh, I saw him come down right alongside one of our destroyers, replied another. The Germans fight well in a crowd. They know how to use the sun, and if they surprise you, it's uncomfortable. If 20 or so of them catch 5 of us, we stay and fight, they said. Maybe that's why we got so many of them, added one boy with a grin. They all told the same story about numbers. 6 of us go over, they said, and we meet 12 Germans. If 10 of us go, there are 20 Germans. But they were all anxious to go again. When the squadron took off, one of them remarked quite casually that he'd be back in time for tea. About that time, a boy of 20 drove up in a station wagon. He weighed about 115 pounds. He asked the squadron leader if he could have someone to fly him back to his own field. His voice was loud and flat. His uniform was torn, had obviously been wet. He wore a pair of brown tennis shoes, 3 sizes too big. After he'd gone, I asked one of the men who'd been talking with him what was the matter with him. Oh, he replied, he was shot down over Dunkirk on the first patrol this morning. He landed in the sea, swam to the beach, was bombed for a couple of hours, came home in a paddle steamer. His voice sounds like that because he can't hear himself. You get that way after you've been bombed a few hours, he said. An air gunner with grease and powder marks on his cheek and neck walked in from his plane, unwound his scarf, had a smoke, and sat down to talk over things with his companions. I return you now to Columbia in New York.
June 4th, 1940.
I sat in the House of Commons this afternoon and heard Winston Churchill, Britain's tired old man of the sea, sum up the recent operations. He tried again, as he has tried for nearly 10 years, to warn this country of the threat that impends. He told of the 335,000 troops, British and French, brought back from Dunkirk. British losses exceed 30,000 killed, wounded, and missing. Enormous material losses were sustained. He described how the 8 or 9 German armored divisions swept like a sharp scythe to the right and rear of the northern armies. But the thrust did not reach Dunkirk because of the resistance put up at Boulogne and Calais. Only 30 unwounded survivors were taken off from the port of Calais. He then paid his tribute to the Royal Air Force. It decisively defeated the main strength of the German Air Force, inflicting losses of at least 4 to 1. As he talked of those young flyers, greater than knights of the Round Table or crusaders of old, Mr. Churchill needed only wings and an engine to take off. But wars, he said, are not won by evacuations. Nearly 1,000 guns had been lost. All transport and all armored vehicles with the Northern Army had been lost. A colossal military disaster had occurred, and another blow must be expected almost immediately. Mr. Churchill believed that these islands could be successfully defended, could ride out the storms of war and outlive the menace of tyranny, if necessary for years, if necessary alone. There was a prophetic quality about that speech. We shall go on to the end, he said. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight on the beaches, in the fields, in the streets, and in the hills. We shall never surrender. With those words, the Prime Minister sat down. I have heard Mr. Churchill in the House of Commons at intervals over the last 10 years. I heard his speech on the Norwegian campaign, and I have some knowledge of his writings. Today, he was different. There was little oratory. He wasn't interested in being a showman. He spoke the language of Shakespeare with a direct urgency such as I have never before heard in that house. There were no frills and no tricks. Winston Churchill's speeches have been prophetic. He has talked and written of the German danger for years. He has gone into the political wilderness in defense of his ideas. Today, as Prime Minister, he gave the House of Commons a report, remarkable for its honesty, inspiration, and gravity.
August 24th, 1940.
This is Trafalgar Square. The noise that you hear at the moment is the sound of the air raid sirens. I'm standing here just on the steps of St. Martin's in the Fields. A searchlight just burst into action off in the distance, one single beam sweeping the sky above me now. People are walking along quite quietly, We're just at the entrance of an air raid shelter here, and I must move this cable over just a bit so people can walk in. I can see just straight away in front of me Lord Nelson on top of that big column. There's another searchlight just square behind Nelson's statue. I'll just let you listen to the traffic and the sound of the siren for a moment. Just a few people here walking rather hurriedly toward the air raid shelters. Some of them casually. A man stops in front of me to light a cigarette. Here comes one of those big red buses around the corner. Double-deckers they are. Just a few lights on the top deck. In this blackness, it looks very much like a ship that's passing in the night, and you just see the portholes. There goes another bus. More searchlights come into action. You see them reach straight up into the sky, and occasionally they catch a cloud and seem to splash on the bottom of it. The little traffic lights here, just a small cross on the normal globe, are now red. The cars pull up and stop. I'll just ooze down in the darkness here along these steps and see if I can pick up the sound of people's feet as they walk along. It's one of the strangest sounds one can hear in London these days, or rather these dark nights. Just the sound of footsteps walking along the street, like ghosts shod with steel shoes. A taxi draws up just in front and stops, just waiting for that red light to change to green while the sirens howl. There it goes, and the cars move off. More searchlights are in action. We've not yet seen any burst of anti-aircraft fire overhead. An air raid warden walks out of this shelter. The shelter here, you know, is the crypt underneath this famous old church, just on the edge of Trafalgar Square. The crypt where in days of peace homeless men and women were able to find a night's lodging.
August 25th, 1940.
The damage done by an exploding bomb to windows in a given area is a freakish sort of thing. A bomb may explode at an intersection, and the blast will travel down 2 streets, shattering windows for a considerable distance, while big windows within a few yards of the bomb crater remain intact. The glass, incidentally, generally falls out into the street rather than being blown inwards. I've seen a number of air battles and bombings and heard more. Perhaps this is a good time to give one observer's impressions, something in the nature of an interim report. The strongest impression one gets of these bombings is a sense of unreality. Often the planes are so high that even in a cloudless sky you can't see them. I've stood on a hill watching an aerodrome being bombed 2 miles away. It looked and sounded like farmers blasting stumps in western Washington. You forget entirely that there are men down there on the ground. Even when the dive bombers come down looking like a duck with both wings broken, and you hear the hollow grunt of their bombs, it doesn't seem to have much meaning. It's almost impossible to realize that men are killing and being killed, even when you see that ever-thickening streak of smoke pouring down from the sky, which means a plane and perhaps several men going down in flames. On the other hand, when the bombs fall nearby, it's possible to assume the most undignified position in the world without effort and without thinking. The position officially recommended: flat on the ground, face down, mouth slightly open, and hands covering ears. Even then, the bombs somehow don't seem to make as much noise as they should, but they do seem real. In one village, you'll see people standing in doorways, all staring in the same direction. Their faces expressionless, reflect no fear and little anxiety. It's another village or another town that's being bombed. I don't believe the proceedings seem very real to them either. I'm trying to tell you that this business of being bombed and watching air fights is the sort of thing which fails to produce the anticipated reaction. The sense of danger, death, and disaster comes only when the familiar incidents occur, the things that one has associated with tragedy since childhood. The sight of half a dozen ambulances weighted down with an unseen cargo of human wreckage has jarred me more than the roar of dive bombers or the sound of bombs. Another thing that has meaning is fire. Again, that's something one can understand. Last night, as I stood on London Bridge and watched that red glow in the sky, it was possible to understand that that fire was the result of an act of war. But the act itself, even the sound of the bomb that started the fire, was still unreal. What had happened was that 3 or 4 high school boys with some special training had been flying around over London in about $100,000 worth of machinery. One of them had pressed a button. The fire and a number of casualties was the result. We could see the fire and hear the clanging of the fire engine bells, but we hadn't seen the bomber, had barely heard him. Maybe the children who are now growing up will in future wars be able to associate the sound of bombs, the drone of engines, and the tearing sound of machine guns overhead with human tragedy and disaster. But for me, the ambulances and the red flare of fire in the night sky are the outward signs of death and destruction.
September 22nd, 1940.
I'm standing on a rooftop looking out over London. At the moment, everything is quiet. For reasons of national as well as personal security, I am unable to tell you the exact location from which I'm speaking. Off to my left, far away in the distance, I can see just that faint, red, angry snap of anti-aircraft bursts against this steel blue sky. But the guns are so far away that it's impossible to hear them from this location. About 5 minutes ago, the guns in the immediate vicinity were working. I can look across just at a building not far away and see something that looks like a splash of white paint down the side. And I know from daylight observation that about a quarter of that building has disappeared, hit by a bomb the other night. Streets fan out in all directions from here, and down on one street I can see a single red light, and just faintly the outline of a sign standing in the middle of the street. And again, I know what that sign says, because I saw it this afternoon. It says, "Danger, unexploded bomb." Off to my left still, I can see just that red snap of the anti-aircraft fire. I was up here earlier this afternoon and looking out over these housetops, looking all the way to the dome of St. Paul's. I saw many flags flying from staffs. No one ordered these people to put out the flags. They simply feel like flying the Union Jack above their roofs. No one told them to do it, and no flag up there was white. I can see 1 or 2 of them just stirring very faintly in the breeze now. You may be able to hear the sound of guns off in the distance, very faintly, like someone kicking a tub. Now they're silent. 4 searchlights reach up, disappear in the light of a 3/4 moon. I should say at the moment there are probably 3 aircraft in the general vicinity of London, because one can tell by the movement of the lights and the flash of the anti-aircraft guns. But at the moment, in the central area, everything is quiet. More searchlights spring up over on my right. I think probably in a minute we shall have the sound of guns in the immediate vicinity. The lights are swinging over in this general direction now. You'll hear 2 explosions. Just there they are. Again, moving in, still a considerable distance away. Moving still just a little closer. There you heard 2. The searchlights are stretching out now in this general direction. I can hear just the faint whisper of an aircraft high overhead. Again, those guns are a considerable distance away. You'll hear them just vaguely in the background. Straight in front of me now. You'll hear 2 sounds in just a moment. There they are. That was the explosion overhead, not the guns themselves. I should think in a few minutes there may be a bit of shrapnel around here. Coming in, moving a little closer all the while. The plane is still very high, and it's quite clear that he's not coming in for his bombing run. Earlier this evening, we could hear occasionally, again, those were explosions overhead. Earlier this evening, we heard a number of bombs go sliding and slithering across to fall several blocks away. Just overhead now, the burst of the anti-aircraft fire. Still, the nearby guns are not working. And the searchlights now are feeling almost directly overhead. Now you'll hear 2 bursts a little nearer in a moment. There they are. That hard, stony sound.
September 29th, 1940.
Tonight, I can give you some idea of what it's like to get away from it all. Away from the bombs, the guns, and the strained faces. I've spent nearly 2 days down in West Somerset. That's near the Bristol Channel. The train left from a station that's been bombed and burned by Dr. Gubbles, but I couldn't see any signs of damage. Dinner on the train was as usual. The coffee is still undrinkable, and the cheese is just cheese. It doesn't masquerade under such fancy names as Gorgonzola or Stilton. But they still serve those little red radishes with it. We were only 15 minutes late at the end of a 4-hour trip. Then half an hour by car to a little village tucked away at the end of a finger of salt water. A dozen houses and a tiny little hotel. A row of red geraniums standing guard in front of a whitewashed stone wall. The landlord said, "You'll sleep well tonight," but I didn't. All night, a gentle breeze off the channel nibbled and scratched at the thatched roof outside my window. Sounded like incendiaries coming down. The swish of gravel on the beach as each wave retreated resembled that distant sound of falling brick and mortar following a bomb explosion. The clang of iron-shod horses' hooves on stone road was like distant gunfire, but it was only the mounted night patrol riding up to Exmoor, lying brown and wrinkled like a carpet mountain behind the hotel. That's hunting and shooting country down there, and they take their night patrol seriously. At 8 in the morning, a German bomber crashed on the beach 300 yards from the hotel. 3 members of the crew walked out. The 4th was dead. The 3 Germans were taken away across the fields in a small car, with an armed horseman in front and another behind. It was the first time the war had come to the village. There was great excitement. The bar did a rushing business. The tide came in and covered the twin-engine bomber. The bombing of London, the progress of the war was forgotten. You must remember, there had been only 2 air raid alarms in the village during the last year. An old lady said she was sorry the Germans had discovered her village. I walked across the moors on grass that seemed to have springs for roots to a little village beside a stream. There was an old Roman footbridge across the stream. The name of the hotel was the Royal Oak. The landlord provided a huge tea, thick cream and all the rest. Explained that he had enough food to last a year, even if nothing came in. Offered me a fresh pork sandwich. I said, "I thought you weren't allowed to kill pigs under the new government order." "That's right," he said, "but sometimes they have accidents. This one caught his hind leg in a gate and we had to kill him." His wife wanted to know about London, but the landlord forestalled my answer by saying, "They'll be all right. I was worried about them for a couple of days, but they've got their teeth into this thing now and they'll be all right." And then looking at his snug little hotel and up at the brown slopes of Exmoor, he said a strange thing. He said, "It's too bad some people have to live in terror and fear, being bombed every night, when nothing happens to us. If we could spread it out a bit, all share in it, maybe it wouldn't be so bad." And then I understood what people mean when they say this country is united. Everywhere I noticed a change in people's faces. There was no strain. There was color given by sun and wind. They told me how the beech hedges lining the roads that snaked across the moor were cut back every 14 years, and it would soon be time to cut them back again. And all the time as I listened to those soft voices down in the Lorna Doone country, I kept wondering what was happening in London. So late in the evening, a train brought me back to London. As we neared the outskirts, the conductor came in, turned out the lights, and said apologetically, "I'm afraid there's an air raid on." Arrived at the station, I found a taxi, gave the aged driver the address, and he said, "Right you are, sir. I hope it's still there." It's a strange feeling to ride through dark streets lit by the flash of anti-aircraft fire, wondering whether your home is still standing or whether it's become a pile of ruined rubble during your brief absence. All was well. Somehow I thought London would have changed, but it seems the same. The night raid is still on. The hours away from the city have evaporated. As the man who shared my taxi remarked, it's like coming back to the front lines after a short leave. I return you now to CBS in New York.
December 2nd, 1940.
These broadcasts are done from London at 1:45 in the morning.
Sometimes when they're ended, there's no desire to sleep. Only the urge to go out and walk familiar streets at a time when the night is left to darkness and to me. Wandering around the streets of this city in the early hours of the morning is sometimes exciting. There may be fires, gunfire, and bombs. One may see in the light of flares carefully hidden under canvas human beings looking like broken, cast-away, dust-covered dolls being lifted with careful hands out of a tunnel driven through to the basement of a bombed house. But more often, the streets are empty, the guns silent, and one walks the streets of this proud city accompanied only by a rabble of undisciplined, random thoughts. The sight of a familiar church spire reminds one of Churchill's remark that it will take 10 years to destroy half the city, and that after that, progress will be slower. Occasionally, during November and December, a cold, choking fog comes down to take command of the streets. It seeps down into the shelters in the subways. After a visit to one of those shelters, one climbs the stairs into the damp darkness of the night, pursued by the sound of coughing, and hoping that it will be a mild winter in Europe. During a heavy raid, courage varies in direct proportion to the cold. It's difficult to be brave when you're cold. Sometimes looking in at a fashionable hotel with its bright lights, music, and champagne, and the empty, unfeeling faces of the dancers on the floor, we're reminded again of the Prime Minister's phrase, grim and gay. Those people are neither grim nor gay. One must go to the subways and see men playing poker for a tuppenny limit, women brewing tea, or cab drivers talking on the rank to understand that phrase. There is time, too, to think of British courtesy as well as courage. The good-humored courtesy of taxi drivers and bus conductors, of people who still thank you for asking them to do you a favor, even when it's hard to hear their thanks above the roar of the guns. One night during a terrific barrage, I saw a little man wearing a tin hat running down the middle of the street. He tripped over a rope stretched across the street to prevent traffic from passing an unexploded bomb. His tin hat rolled into the gutter. He retrieved it and said to no one at all, he was quite alone in the street, "Sorry, so sorry," and then he went on his way. Those of us who've been trying to report this war have said too much about courage and too little about courtesy. People who remember to be courteous are not greatly afraid. Walking from Regent's Park to the embankment, there is time to think of the frequent comments overheard during the day. Londoners saying they wish it had been London instead of Liverpool or Southampton that was bombed last night. They know the value of their ports, but it's interesting that they would rather have had the bombs aimed at them than at more vital points. In the early hours of the morning, sometimes between 5 and 7, the high, steady note of the all clear cuts through the cold, frosty air of London. Hundreds of thousands of humans come oozing up from underground, many of them stiff and tired from a night in the shelters. The ducks in Green Park set up their questioning quacking, and the pigeons come back from some mysterious place to Trafalgar Square. Buckets of boiling water are poured into the muzzles of hard-worked guns as they're swabbed out and prepared for another night's work. And always as one walks home with the winter's sun boring through the autumn mists, there's the question, how long can this go on?
December 24th, 1940.
Christmas Day began in London nearly an hour ago. The church bells did not ring at midnight. When they ring again, it will be to announce invasion. And if they ring, the British are ready. And all along the coast of this island, the observers revolve in their reclining chairs, listening for the sound of German planes. The firefighters and the ambulance drivers are waiting too. The blackout stretches from Birmingham to Bethlehem. But tonight, over Britain, the skies are clear. This is not a Merry Christmas in London. I've heard that phrase only twice in the last 3 days. This afternoon, as the stores were closing, as shoppers and office workers were hurrying home, one heard such phrases as, "So long, Mamie," and "Good luck, Jack," but never a Merry Christmas. It can't be a Merry Christmas. For those people who spend tonight and tomorrow by their firesides in their own homes realize that they have bought this Christmas with their nerve, their bodies, and their old buildings. Their nerve is unshaken. The casualties have not been large.
and there are many old buildings still untouched. Tonight, there are a few Christmas parties in London, a few expensive dinners at famous hotels, but there are no fancy paper hats and no firecrackers. I should like to add my small voice to give my own Christmas greetings to friends and colleagues at home. Merry Christmas, so long, and good luck.
March 9th, 1941.
This is London. Soon it will be spring in England. Already there are flowers in the parks, although the parks aren't quite as well kept as they were at this time last year. The winter that is ending has been hard, but Londoners have many reasons for satisfaction. There have been no serious epidemics. The casualties from air bombardment have been less than expected. And London meets this spring with as much courage, though less complacency, than at this time last year. The other day, watching a farmer trying to fill in a 20-foot deep bomb crater in the middle of his field, I wondered what would happen before he harvested the next crop from that bomb-torn soil. I suppose that many more bombs will fall. There will be much talk about equality of sacrifice, which doesn't exist. Many proud ships will certainly perish in the western approaches. There will be further restrictions on clothes and food. Probably a few profiteers will make their profits. No one knows whether invasion will come, but there are those who fear it will not. I believe that a public opinion poll on the question, would you like the Germans to attempt an invasion, would be answered overwhelmingly in the affirmative. Most people, believing that it must be attempted eventually, would be willing to have it come soon. They think that in no other way can the Germans win this war, and they will not change their minds until they hear their children say, "We are hungry." So long as Winston Churchill is Prime Minister, the House of Commons will be given an opportunity to defend its traditions and to determine the character of the government that is to rule this country. The Prime Minister will continue to be criticized in private for being too much interested in strategy and too little concerned with the great social and economic problems that clamor for solution. British propaganda aimed at occupied countries will continue to fight without its heavy artillery until some sort of statement on war aims, or if you prefer, peace aims, has been published. And in the future, as in the past, one of the strangest sensations for me will be that produced by radio. Sometime, someone will write the story of the technical and military uses to which this new weapon has been put. But no one, I think, will ever describe adequately just what it feels like to sit in London with German bombs ripping through the air, shaking the buildings, and causing the lights to flicker, while you listen to the German radio, broadcasting Wagner or Bavarian folk music. A twist of the dial gives you Tokyo talking about dangerous thoughts, an American senator discussing hemisphere defense, the clipped, precise accent of a British announcer describing the proper method of photographing elephants, Moscow boasting of the prospects of the wheat harvest in the Ukraine, each nation speaking almost any language save its own, until finally you switch off the receiving set in order that the sounds from the four corners of the earth will not interfere with the sound of the German bombs that come close enough to cause you to dive under the desk. The bombs this spring will be bigger, and there'll be more of them, probably dropped from a greater height than ever before. Berlin and London will continue to claim that their bombs hit military targets, while the enemies strike mainly churches, schools, hospitals, and private dwellings. The opening engagement of the spring campaign is now being fought in the Atlantic. The Admiralty has taken over control of the shipyards in an effort to speed up production and repairs. Merchant sinkings will probably reach alarming proportions, but there will always be men to take the ships out. The outcome of the battle in the Atlantic will be decisive. This island lives by its ships, and the ships will be carrying supplies from America. There was no dancing in the streets here when the Lease and Lend Bill was passed, for the British know from their own experience that the gap between legislation and realization can be very wide. They remember being told that their frontier was on the Rhine, and they know now that their government did very little to keep it there. The course of Anglo-American relations will be smooth on the surface, but many people over here will express regret that they believe America is making the same mistakes that Britain made. For you must understand that the idea of America being of more help as a non-belligerent than as a fighting ally has been discarded, even by those who advanced it originally. Maybe we shall hear some frank, forthright talk across the Atlantic instead of rhetoric, but I doubt it. One thing that is not to be doubted is that the decisions taken in Washington between now and the time the crops are harvested will determine the pattern of events for a long time to come. British statesmen are fond of repeating that Britain stands alone as the defender of democracy and decency. But General Headquarters is now on Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. Many Britishers realize that. Not all of them are happy about it. For the policies of Washington have not always been the policies of the Tory party, which still rules this country. Presumably, the decisions of Washington will be taken in the full light of publicity and debate. No mere radio reporter has the right to use the weight of monopolized opportunity in an effort to influence those decisions. We can only deliver to you an occasional wheelbarrow load of stuff, tell you where it comes from, what sort of air raid shelter or bastion you build with it is a matter for free men to decide. But since part of reporting must necessarily be personal, I'd like to end this with my own impression of Britain on the verge of spring and big events. There's still a sense of humor in the country. The old feeling of superiority over all other peoples remains. So does class distinction. There is great courage and a blind belief that Britain will survive. The British aren't all heroes. They know the feeling of fear. I've shared it with them. They try to avoid thinking deeply about political and social problems. They'll stand any amount of government inefficiency and muddle. They're slow to anger, and they die with great dignity. They will cheer Winston Churchill when he walks through block after block of smashed houses and offices as though he brought them a great victory. During a blinding raid, when the streets are full of smoke and the sound of the roaring guns, they'll say to you, "Do you think we're really brave or just lacking in imagination?" Well, they've come through the winter. They've been warned that the testing days are ahead. Of the past months, they may well say, we have lived a life, not an apology. And of the future, I think most of them would say, we shall live hard, but we shall live.
November 7th, 1942.
Our part of the war is going to winter around the Mediterranean. The Axis forces are already spread thin, and this will spread them even more. The key to the whole operation, carefully timed to coincide with the offensive in Egypt, is Tripoli. Tripoli in Allied hands would mean the end of Axis hopes in Africa. The secret of this operation was well kept. Many knew something was coming, but few knew where and when. But tonight, radio transmitters are hot, carrying the message to the continent. Tonight's news will lift British hearts, but there will be no final flourish of trumpets. This may be the turning point of the war, but the road to this point has been long and hard, and every child here knows that Germany must finally be beaten on the continent. We went to Africa because we had the stuff to go there. There is no news about resistance encountered, but there is no reason to think it will not be stubborn. The people who are running this operation did not expect a picnic. This action may not fully satisfy the Russians, but at least they knew all about it in advance. It's a combined operation, launched after careful planning. We chose the time, the place, and the ground. This offensive is commanded by General Eisenhower, and he is not a man to look back. I have heard him say that when units of his army went anywhere, there would be no coming back. If ever a general enjoyed the confidence and respect of his troops, it's Ike Eisenhower. This is the second installment of the offensive phase. There will be others, and probably before very long. But this is no time for speculation.
December 24th, 1942.
This is London, and this is the fourth Christmas Eve. The beef eaters may have become spam eaters, but no one has seen Scrooge about tonight. Our men have been giving parties for British children. They have made toys of odd bits of wood and metal. Big, tough sergeants have played Santa Claus. Thousands of British children, especially the orphans and the poor, have had a memorable time thanks to the Americans. Our men are the best fed, best paid, and best uniformed soldiers in this war.
And this Christmas they have certainly maintained the American tradition of good-natured generosity. Some of them are a little homesick, but you couldn't tell it by looking at them. I've asked many of them what they'd like to say if they were talking to America tonight. And most of them have said, well, you see, it's a little tough to know what to say. But you know how it is. I've an idea. Most of them would tell you, don't worry too much. We're all right, and we're amongst friends. And some of them on this dark night might repeat the words written a long time ago. Though there be darkness, it shall be as the morning, and thou shalt be secure, because there is hope.
December 3rd, 1943.
Last night, some of the young gentlemen of the RAF took me to Berlin. The pilot was called Jock. The crew captains walked into the briefing room, looked at the maps and charts, and sat down with their big celluloid pads on their knees. The atmosphere was that of a school and a church. The weatherman gave us the weather. The pilots were reminded that Berlin is Germany's greatest center of war production. The intelligence officer told us how many heavy and light ack-ack guns, how many searchlights we might expect to encounter. Then, Jock, the wing commander, explained a system of markings, the kind of flares that would be used by the pathfinders. He said that concentration was the secret of success in these raids, that as long as the aircraft stayed well bunched, they would protect each other. The captains of aircraft walked out. I noticed that the big Canadian with the slow, easy grin had printed Berlin at the top of his pad and then embellished it with a scroll. The red-headed English boy with the 2-week-old mustache was the last to leave the room. Late in the afternoon, we went to the locker room to draw parachutes, Mae Wests, and all the rest. As we dressed, a couple of the Australians were whistling. Walking out to the bus that was to take us to the aircraft, I heard the station loudspeakers announcing that that evening all personnel would be able to see a film, Star-Spangled Rhythm, free. We went out and stood around a big black 4-motored Lancaster, D for dog. A small station wagon delivered a thermos bottle of coffee, chewing gum, an orange, and a bit of chocolate for each man. Up in that part of England, the air hums and throbs with the sound of aircraft motors all day. But for half an hour before takeoff, the skies are dead, silent, and expectant. A lone hawk hovered over the airfield, absolutely still as he faced into the wind. Jack, the tail gunner, said, "It'd be nice if we could fly like that." D-Dog eased around the perimeter track to the end of the runway. We sat there for a moment. The green light flashed, and we were rolling, 10 seconds ahead of schedule. The takeoff was smooth as silk. The wheels came up, and D-Dog started the long climb. As we came up through the clouds, I looked right and left and counted 14 black Lancasters climbing for the place where men must burn oxygen to live. The sun was going down, and its red glow made rivers of lakes of fire on tops of the clouds. Down to the southward, the clouds piled up to form castles, battlements, and whole cities, all tinged with red. Soon we were out over the North Sea. Dave, the navigator, asked Jock if he couldn't make a little more speed. We were nearly 2 minutes late. By this time, we were all using oxygen. The talk on the intercom was brief and crisp. Everyone sounded relaxed. For a while, the 8 of us, in our little world in exile, moved over the sea. There was a quarter moon on the starboard beam. Jock's quiet voice came through the intercom, "That'll be flak ahead." We were approaching the enemy coast. The flak looked like a cigarette lighter in a dark room, one that won't light. Sparks, but no flame. The sparks crackling just above the level of the cloud tops. We flew steady and straight, and soon the flak was directly below us. D-Dog rocked a little from right to left, but that wasn't caused by the flak. We were in the slipstream of other Lancasters ahead, and we were over the enemy coast. And then a strange thing happened. The aircraft seemed to grow smaller. Jack in the rear turret, Wally, the mid-upper gunner, Titch, the wireless operator, All seemed somehow to draw closer to Jock in the cockpit. It was as though each man's shoulder was against the other's. The understanding was complete. The intercom came to life, and Jock said, "2 aircraft on the port beam." Jack in the tail said, "Okay, sir." They're Lanks. The whole crew was a unit and wasn't wasting words. The cloud below was 10 tenths. The blue-green jet of the exhausts licked back along the leading edge, and there were other aircraft all around us. The whole great aerial armada was hurtling towards Berlin. We flew so for 20 minutes. When Jock looked up at a vapor trail curling across above us, remarking in a conversational tone that from the look of it he thought there was a fighter up there. Occasionally the angry red of Ack burst through the clouds, but it was far away, and we took only an academic interest. We were flying in the 3rd wave. Jock asked Wally in the mid-upper turret and Jack in the rear turret if they were cold. They said they were all right and thanked him for asking. He even asked how I was, and I said, "All right so far." The cloud was beginning to thin out. Off to the north we could see lights, and the flak began to liven up ahead of us. Boz, the bomb aimer, crackled through on the intercom, "There's a battle going on the starboard beam." We couldn't see the aircraft, but we could see the jets of red tracer being exchanged. Suddenly there was a burst of yellow flame, and Jock remarked, "That's a fighter going down. Note the position." The whole thing was interesting, but remote. Dave, the navigator, who was sitting back with his maps, charts, and compasses, said, "The attack ought to begin in exactly 2 minutes." We were still over the clouds. But suddenly, those dirty gray clouds turned white. We were over the outer searchlight defenses. The clouds below us were white, and we were black. D-Dog seemed like a black bug on a white sheet. The flak began coming up, but none of it close. We were still a long way from Berlin. I didn't realize just how far. Jock observed, "There's a kite on fire dead ahead." It was a great golden, slow-moving meteor slanting towards the earth. By this time, we were about 30 miles from our target area in Berlin. That 30 miles was the longest flight I have ever made. Dead on time, Buzz, the bomb aimer, reported, "Target indicators going down." At the same moment, the sky ahead was lit up by bright yellow flares. Off to starboard, another kite went down in flames. The flares were sprouting all over the sky, reds and greens and yellows, and we were flying straight for the center of the fireworks. D-Dog seemed to be standing still, the 4 propellers thrashing the air, but we didn't seem to be closing in. The cloud had cleared, and off to the starboard a Lank was caught by at least 14 searchlight beams. We could see him twist and turn and finally break out, but still the whole thing had a quality of unreality about it. No one seemed to be shooting at us, but it was getting lighter all the time. Suddenly, a tremendous big blob of yellow light appeared dead ahead, another to the right and another to the left. We were flying straight for them. Jock pointed out to me the dummy fires and flares to right and left, but we kept going in. Dead ahead, there was a whole chain of red flares, looking like stoplights. Another Lank was coned on our starboard beam. The light seemed to be supporting it. Again, we could see those little bubbles of colored lead driving at it from 2 sides. The German fighters were at him. And then, with no warning at all, D-Dog was filled with an unhealthy white light. I was standing just behind Jock and could see all the seams on the wings. His quiet Scots voice beat into my ears, "Steady, lads, we've been coned." His slender body lifted, half out of the seat, as he jammed the control column forward and to the left. We were going down. Jock was wearing woolen gloves with the fingers cut off. I could see his fingernails turn white as he gripped the wheel. And then I was on my knees, flat on the deck, for he had whipped the dog back into a climbing turn. The knees should have been strong enough to support me, but they weren't. And the stomach seemed in some danger of letting me down, too. I picked myself up and looked out again. It seemed that one big searchlight, instead of being 20,000 feet below, was mounted right on our wingtip. D-Dog was corkscrewing. As we rolled down on the other side, I began to see what was happening to Berlin. The clouds were gone, and the sticks of incendiaries from the preceding waves made the place look like a badly laid out city with the streetlights on. The small incendiaries were going down like a fistful of white rice thrown on a piece of black velvet. As Jock hauled the dog up again, I was thrown to the other side of the cockpit, and there below were more incendiaries, glowing white and then turning red. The cookies, the 4,000-pound high explosives, were bursting below like great sunflowers gone mad. And then as we started down again, still held in the lights, I remembered that the dog still had one of those cookies and a whole basket of incendiaries in his belly, and the light still held us, and I was very frightened. While Jock was flinging him about in the air, he suddenly flung over the intercom 2 aircraft on the port beam. I looked astern and saw Wally, the mid-upper, whip his turret around to port, and then looked up to see a single-engine fighter slide just above us. The other aircraft was one of ours. Finally, we were out of the cone, flying level. I looked down, and the white fires had turned red. They were beginning to merge and spread, just like butter does on a hot plate. Jock and Boz, the bomb aimer, began to discuss the target. The smoke was getting thick down below. Boz said he liked the 2 green flares on the ground almost dead ahead. He began calling his directions. And just then, a new bunch of big flares went down on the far side of the sea of flame and flare that seemed to be directly below us. He thought that would be a better aiming point. Jock agreed, and we flew on. The bomb doors were open. Boz called his directions. 5 left, 5 left. And then there was a gentle, confident upward thrust under my feet, and Boz said, "Cookie gone." A few seconds later, the incendiaries went, and D-Dog seemed lighter and easier to handle. I thought I could make out the outline of streets below, but the bomb aimer didn't agree, and he ought to know. By this time, all those patches of white on black had turned yellow and started to flow together. Another searchlight caught us, but didn't hold us. Then through the intercom came the word, "1 can of incendiaries didn't clear. We're still carrying it." And Jock replied, "Is it a big one or a little one?" The word came back, "Little one, I think, but I'm not sure. I'll check." More of those yellow flares came down and hung about us. I haven't seen so much light since the war began. Finally, the intercom announced that it was only a small container of incendiaries left, and Jock remarked, "Well, it's hardly worth going back and doing another run-up for that." If there had been a good fat bundle left, he would have gone back through that stuff and done it all over again. I began to breathe and to reflect again that all men would be brave if only they could leave their stomachs at home. When there was a tremendous whoomp, an unintelligible shout from the tail gunner, and D-Dog shivered and lost altitude. I looked to the port side, and there was a Lancaster that seemed close enough to touch. He had whipped straight under us, missed us by 25, 50 feet. No one knew how much. The navigator sang out the new course, and we were heading for home. Jock was doing what I had heard him tell his pilots to do so often, flying dead on course. He flew straight into a huge green searchlight, and as he rammed the throttles home, remarked, "We'll have a little trouble getting away from this one." And again, D-Dog dove, climbed, and twisted, and was finally free. We flew level then. I looked on the port beam at the target area. There was a red, sullen, obscene glare. The fires seemed to have found each other, and we were heading home. For a little while, it was smooth sailing. We saw more battle, then another plane in flames, but no one could tell whether it was ours or theirs. We were still near the target. Dave, the navigator, said, "Hold her steady, Skipper. I want to get an astro sight." And Jock held her steady, and the flak began coming up at it. It seemed to be very close. It was winking off both wings, but the dog was steady. Finally, Dave said, "Okay, Skipper. Thank you very much." And a great orange blob of
flak smacked up straight in front of us. And Jock said, "I think they're shooting at us." I'd thought so for some time. And he began to throw D for dog up, around, and about again. When we were clear of the barrage, I asked him how close the bursts were, and he said, "Not very close. When they're really near, you can smell them." That proved nothing, for I'd been holding my breath. Jack sang out from the rear turret, said his oxygen was getting low, thought maybe the lead had frozen. Titch, the wireless operator, went scrambling back with a new mask and a bottle of oxygen. Dave, the navigator, said we're crossing the coast. My mind went back to the time I had crossed that coast in 1938 in a plane that had taken off from Prague. Just ahead of me sat two refugees from Vienna, an old man and his wife. The co-pilot came back and told them that we were outside German territory. The old man reached out and grasped his wife's hand. The work that was done last night was a massive blow of retribution for all those who have fled from the sound of shots and blows on a stricken continent. We began to lose height over the North Sea. We were over England's shore. The land was dark beneath us. Somewhere down there below, American boys were probably bombing up fortresses and liberators, getting ready for the day's work. We were over the home field. We called the control tower, and the calm, clear voice of an English girl replied, "Greetings, D-Dog. You are diverted to Mulebag." We swung round, contacted Mulebag, came in on the flare path, touched down very gently, ran along to the end of the runway and turned left. And Jock, the finest pilot in Bomber Command, said to the control tower, "D-Dog, clear of runway." When we went in for interrogation, I looked on the board and saw that the big, slow-smiling Canadian and the red-headed English boy with the 2-week-old mustache hadn't made it. They were missing. There were 4 reporters on this operation. 2 of them didn't come back. 2 friends of mine, Norman Stockton of Australian Associated Newspapers and Lowell Bennett, an American representing International News Service. There is something of a tradition amongst reporters that those who are prevented by circumstances from filing their stories will be covered by their colleagues. This has been my effort to do so. In the aircraft in which I flew, the men who flew and fought it poured into my ears their comments on fighters' flak and flares in the same tone that they would have used in reporting a host of daffodils. I have no doubt that Bennett and Stockton would have given you a better report of last night's activities. Berlin was a kind of orchestrated hell, a terrible symphony of light and flame.
June 6th, 1944, D-Day.
All day, Allied heavy bombers have been operating in support of the ground troops. They have encountered no fighter opposition. The action so far seems to have been almost too easy. The reputation of the German armies is still considerable, and there is no disposition to discount their power to hit back. And there is no official admission that our bridgehead is free from concentrated artillery fire. But the general impression is that we are now in a position to start pouring the material ashore, the tanks and the self-propelled artillery. Eyewitness accounts indicate that all movement has ceased in the area of the attack. The roads and rails carry no traffic. That means that the bombers can now start working further inland. Here is a report from Charles Collingwood, Columbia's correspondent with the Navy, who was with a tank landing craft. He says the first craft onto the beaches were the little LCVPs. They came in doggedly, looking very small and gallant with their heads up. Offshore, several miles, loomed the silhouettes of the big ships. Between them and the beaches milled an assemblage of landing craft of all kinds, forming up, waiting to go in. A few thousand yards offshore, 2 patrol boats stood, a mile or so apart. They marked the starting line. They were just out of range of effective machine gun fire. On those boats, each wave of landing craft dressed like a unit of foot soldiers, and were then dispatched to the beach. More and more men reached the beach. At one end of the beachhead, a little knot of German prisoners began to form.
Back among the big ships, the admiral decided he could now send in his bigger landing vessels, send them into the shore. The LCIs and the LSTs sidled to the starting line and then headed for the beach. An LCI is 155 feet long and carries more than 200 soldiers. When she hits the shore, a ramp is let down from each side and the soldiers pour out onto the beach. An LST is bigger still. She's a great floating garage. When she reaches shore, her mouth opens and trucks and vehicles of every description roll out of her and are lifted by davits from her hold. When these ships go in, the landing is well underway and their cargoes quickly build up the power of the assault.
September 17th, 1944.
We've been flying straight into Holland now for something like 20 minutes. So far, without any opposition, at least none that I have been able to see. Our fighters are down just almost nosing along the hedgerows, searching the little villages, and they're up above us and on both sides. This is the real meaning of air power, and it seems that the Dutch realize it as well, because in a little village that we're just passing over, I can see at least 24 people standing along the narrow, winding street. Some of them are children, and I can see that most of them seem to be wearing a white shirt or a white blouse of some kind. There go the parapacks on a formation ahead of us, yellow, brown, red, drifting down gently, dropping the containers. I can't see the bodies of the men. Yes, I can. The chutes ahead of us are still going on. There's a burst of flak right there. I think it's coming from a railway embankment just down to the left. It was certainly considerably under us and just ahead of us then. It's the first flak we've seen. There was one burst of light flak. There's another. More tracers going across just in front of our nose. I think it's coming from that little village just beside the canal. More tracer coming up now, just cutting across in front of our nose. A lovely orange color it is. We're down just about to the drop altitude now. In just about 30 seconds, these 19 men will walk out onto Dutch soil. You can probably hear the snap as they check the lashing on the static line. We're throttled back now. There it goes. Do you hear them shout? 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. There they go. Every man out. I can see their chutes going down now. Every man clear. They're dropping just beside a little windmill near a church, hanging there very gracefully. Seem to be completely relaxed, like nothing so much as khaki dolls hanging beneath a green lampshade.
April 1945. The return to Germany.
After a couple of weeks traveling in Germany, one gets the feeling that for the Germans this is a kind of delayed action war. Their cities have been ruined, and in many cases the destruction is complete. They have lost many dead and wounded. Most of their men will be in Allied prison cages when the war is over, and it will be some time before they are home again. But in addition to all this, the Germans will have no transport left. They have wrecked their bridges. The war has swallowed up their horses and their hopes. Their factories are in ruins. A city is completely surrounded and is asked to surrender. The local authority refuses, and our troops start in. There is resistance from a couple of houses. Tanks move up and cut the houses down. The Germans pull back, nearer to the center of the city, but they keep shooting. They did that for 3 days at Nuremberg, and that city may be said to be dead. There are a few walls still standing, and the cathedral spires are still there. But Nuremberg has been wiped out. Most of Bayreuth is gone, too. Wagner's piano is still there, but part of the house has been knocked down. Rare books and fine manuscripts are trampled underfoot. There is an empty champagne bottle on top of the piano. The young lieutenant in charge of military government has written a letter to Army asking for permission to put a guard on the place. There is no lack of looting in Germany. The foreign workers are interested in food and clothing, and they will go after it right under the machine gun fire. The other day, a Pole found a suit of clothes in a boxcar. As he carried it away, he said, "This, my pay, 5 years' work." In Nuremberg,
A Russian walked down a street that was under small arms fights. It must have weighed 70 pounds. He was interested in that cheese, not in the firing. As a new burp gun opened up around the corner, an American corporal said, "Hey, Mac, you know any place around here where I can get some films developed?" There wasn't a building standing in a radius of a mile, but he was entirely serious. There are places down near the Czechoslovakian border where you can drive for 60 miles on a superhighway and meet no traffic. You are never sure where our forward elements are. And when you do find an outfit, they're never sure just where they are in relation to other units. The tired driver of an armored car said he remembered a town, but that was about 3 days ago, and he couldn't recall its name, but he'd had a glass of beer there, and it was a dusty little place. In the larger cities, there's occasional firing at night, but not very much. The werewolves aren't very active, at least not in the areas behind the 1st and 3rd Armies. The other night we were caught in a traffic jam, leaving a pontoon bridge. There was a half moon, and the night was mild. A Strauss waltz came from the radio in a command car. The 2 lines of traffic did not move. A Western voice said, "What's the trouble down there?" And a voice from the deep south answered, "There's a one-way bridge and the traffic is moving in 3 directions." We crawled forward a few yards. There was a jet plane somewhere high overhead. A Negro truck driver said, "He's a-coming over," but he didn't come. The apple blossoms on the right were golden in the moonlight. There were apple blossoms when some of those boys landed in Normandy.
April 15th, 1945.
Permit me to tell you what you would have seen and heard had you been with me on Thursday. It will not be pleasant listening. If you're at lunch, or if you have no appetite to hear what Germans have done, now is a good time to switch off the radio. For I propose to tell you of Buchenwald. It is on a small hill about 4 miles outside Weimar, and it was one of the largest concentration camps in Germany, and it was built to last. As we approached it, we saw about 100 men in civilian clothes with rifles, advancing in open order across a field. There were a few shots. We stopped to inquire. We're told that some of the prisoners had a couple of SS men cornered in there. We drove on, reached the main gate. The prisoners crowded up behind the wire. We entered. And now let me tell this in the first person, for I was the least important person there, as you shall hear. There surged around me an evil-smelling horde. Men and boys reached out to touch me. They were in rags and the remnants of uniforms. Death had already marked many of them, but they were smiling with their eyes. I looked out over that mass of men to the green fields beyond, where well-fed Germans were plowing. A German, Fritz Kirchheimer, came up and said, "May I show you around the camp? I've been here 10 years. An Englishman stood to attention saying, "May I introduce myself? Delighted to see you. And can you tell me when some of our blokes will be along?" I told him soon, and asked to see one of the barracks. It happened to be occupied by Czechoslovakians. When I entered, men crowded around, tried to lift me to their shoulders. They were too weak. Many of them could not get out of bed. I was told that this building had once stabled 80 horses. There were 1,200 men in it, 5 to a bunk. The stink was beyond all description. When I reached the center of the barracks, a man came up and said, "You remember me. I am Peter Zenkel, one-time mayor of Prague." I remembered him, but did not recognize him. He asked about Benish and Jan Masaryk. I asked how many men had died in that building during the last month. They called the doctor. We inspected his records. There were only names in the little black book, nothing more. Nothing who these men were, what they had done, or hoped. Behind the names of those who had died, there was a cross. I counted them. They totaled 242. 242 out of 1,200 in 1 month. As I walked down to the end of the barracks, there was applause from the men too weak to get out of bed. It sounded like the hand clapping of babies. They were so weak. The doctor's name was Paul Heller. He had been there since '38. As we walked out into the courtyard, a man fell dead. 2 others, they must have been over 60, were crawling towards the latrine. I saw it, but will not describe it. In another part of the camp, they showed me the children, hundreds of them. Some were only 6. One rolled up his sleeve, showed me his number. It was tattooed on his arm. D 6030 it was.
The others showed me their numbers. They will carry them till they die. An elderly man standing beside me said, the children, enemies of the state. I could see their ribs through their thin shirts. The old man said, I am Professor Charles Richet of the Sorbonne. The children clung to my hands and stared. We crossed to the courtyard. Men kept coming up to speak to me and to touch me. Professors from Poland, doctors from Vienna, men from all Europe. Men from the countries that made America. We went to the hospital. It was full. The doctor told me that 200 had died the day before. I asked the cause of death. He shrugged and said, tuberculosis, starvation, fatigue, and there are many who have no desire to live. It is very difficult. Dr. Heller pulled back the blankets from a man's feet to show me how swollen they were. The man was dead. Most of the patients could not move. As we left the hospital, I drew out a leather billfold, hoping that I had some money which would help those who lived to get home. Professor Richet from the Sorbonne said, I should be careful of my wallet if I were you. You know, there are criminals in this camp, too. A small man tottered up saying, may I feel the leather, please? You see, I used to make good things of leather in Vienna. Another man said, my name is Walter Röde. For many years I lived in Joliet. Came back to Germany for a visit, and Hitler grabbed me. I asked to see the kitchen. It was clean. The German in charge had been a communist, had been at Buchenwald for 9 years, had a picture of his daughter in Hamburg, hadn't seen her for almost 12 years. And if I got to Hamburg, would I look her up? He showed me the daily ration, one piece of brown bread about as thick as your thumb. On top of it, a piece of margarine, as big as 3 sticks of chewing gum. That and a little stew was what they received every 24 hours. He had a chart on the wall, very complicated it was. There were little red tabs scattered through it. He said that was to indicate each 10 men who died. He had to account for the rations, and he added, we're very efficient here. We went again into the courtyard, and as we walked, we talked. The 2 doctors, the Frenchman and the Czech, agreed that about 6,000 had died during March. Kirchenheimer, the German, added that back in the winter of 39, when the Poles began to arrive, without winter clothing, they died at the rate of approximately 900 a day. 5 different men asserted that Buchenwald was the best concentration camp in Germany. They had had some experience of the others. Dr. Heller, the Czech, asked if I would care to see the crematorium. He said it wouldn't be very interesting because the Germans had run out of coke some days ago and had taken to dumping the bodies into a great hole nearby. Professor Richet said, perhaps I would care to see the small courtyard. I said yes. He turned and told the children to stay behind. As we walked across the square, I noticed that the professor had a hole in his left shoe and a toe sticking out of the right one. He followed my eyes and said, I regret that I am so little presentable, but what can one do? At that point, another Frenchman came up to announce that 3 of his fellow countrymen outside had killed 3 SS men and taken 1 prisoner. We proceeded to the small courtyard. The wall was about 8 feet high. It adjoined what had been a stable or garage. We entered. It was floored with concrete. There were 2 rows of bodies stacked up like cordwood. They were thin and very white. Some of the bodies were terribly bruised, though there seemed to be little flesh to bruise. Some had been shot through the head, but they bled but little. All except 2 were naked. I tried to count them as best I could, and arrived at the conclusion that all that was mortal of more than 500 men and boys lay there in 2 neat piles. There was a German trailer, which must have contained another 50, but it wasn't possible to count them. The clothing was piled in a heap against the wall. It appeared that most of the men and boys had died of starvation. They had not been executed. But the manner of death seemed unimportant. Murder had been done at Buchenwald. God alone knows how many men and boys have died there during the last 12 years. Thursday, I was told that there were more than 20,000 in the camp. There had been as many as 60,000. Where are they now? As I left that camp, a Frenchman who used to work for Havas in Paris came up to me and said, you will write something about this, perhaps. And he added, to write about this, you must have been here at least 2 years. And after that, you don't want to write anymore. I pray you to believe what I have said about Buchenwald. I have reported what I saw and heard, but only part of it. For most of it I have no words. Dead men are plentiful in war, but the living dead, more than 20,000 of them in one camp. And the country round about was pleasing to the eye, and the Germans were well fed and well dressed. American trucks were rolling towards the rear, filled with prisoners. Soon they would be eating American rations, as much for a meal as the men at Buchenwald received in 4 days. If I have offended you by this rather mild account of Buchenwald, I am not in the least sorry. I was there on Thursday, and many men in many tongues blessed the name of Roosevelt. For long years, his name had meant the full measure of their hope. These men, who had kept close company with death for many years, did not know that Mr. Roosevelt would, within hours, join their comrades who had laid their lives on the scales of freedom. Back in 41, Mr. Churchill said to me, with tears in his eyes, "One day the world and history will recognize and acknowledge what it owes to your president." I saw and heard the first installment of that at Buchenwald on Thursday. It came from men from all over Europe. Their faces, with more flesh on them, might have been found anywhere at home. To them, the name Roosevelt was a symbol, the code word for a lot of guys named Joe, who were somewhere out in the blue with the armor heading east. At Buchenwald, they spoke of the president just before he died. If there be a better epitaph, history does not record it.
May 8th, 1945.
This is Piccadilly Circus, that rather small open space in the center of London where in peacetime the traffic used to go round and then spill out into 5 separate streets. But believe me, tonight there is no traffic in Piccadilly Circus. I can remember this place when it was completely empty and you could read a newspaper by the light of the flares dropped by German bombers. There was a time when our bomber boys said that you could walk on the flak when you were flying over the Ruhr, and tonight you could walk on the heads of people all the way across Piccadilly Circus. They're jammed absolutely tight. A few minutes ago, a motorcycle went through, and there were 4 people on it, and now people are throwing confetti at me. I'm down on the sidewalk with a policeman here who is altogether inadequate protection. Now, we're just going to ask the policeman here what he thinks of the crowd and whether or not he has had any trouble. Has it been a fairly well-mannered crowd?
I think they're a marvelous crowd. A grand lot of people, not causing us any disturbance whatsoever.
Now, we're just...
All I hope is they'll soon go home.
Now, we're just going to check that statement that we had from the policeman because there's another gentleman here from the Red Cross and St. John's Ambulance. That is the organization here that takes care of the casualties, shall we say, in this celebration. Have you had many casualties today, sir?
Well, it's not been too bad, you know, today. People have been very good on the whole, although the weather's been very close indeed. But we may get a few extra tonight when they get more excited.
You don't think they've really gotten excited yet?
They're not warmed up to it yet, but they will.
About what time do you think they'll really get going?
Well, about midnight.
About midnight. Incidentally, you may hear an occasional bang in the course of the next few minutes, but it's just effervescent people shooting off fireworks here in Piccadilly Circus.
London, February 24th, 1946.
I believe that I have learned the most important thing that has happened in Britain during the last 6 years. It was not, I think, the demonstration of physical courage. That has been a cheap commodity in this war. Many people of many nations were brave under the bombs. I doubt that the most important thing was Dunkirk or the Battle of Britain, El Alamein or Stalingrad. Not even the landings in Normandy or the great blows struck by British and American bombers. Historians may decide that any one of these events was decisive. But I am persuaded that the most important thing that happened in Britain was that this nation chose to win or lose this war under the established rules of parliamentary procedure. It feared Nazism, but did not choose to imitate it. The government was given dictatorial power, but it was used with restraint, and the House of Commons was ever vigilant. Do you remember that while London was being bombed in the daylight, the House devoted 2 days to discussing conditions under which enemy aliens were detained on the Isle of Man? Though Britain fell, there were to be no concentration camps here. Do you remember that 2 days after Italy declared war, an Italian citizen, convicted of murder in the lower courts, appealed successfully to the highest court in the land, and the original verdict was set aside? There was still law in the land, regardless of race, nationality, or hatred. Representative government, equality before the law survived. Future generations who bother to read the official record of proceedings in the House of Commons will discover that British armies retreated from many places, but that there was no retreat from the principles for which your ancestors fought. The record is massive evidence of the flexibility and toughness of the principles you profess. It will, I think, inspire and lift men's hearts long after the names of most of the great sea and land engagements have been forgotten. It was your answer to the question that was asked all round the world in the decades before that Sunday in September of 1939. The question was, what has happened to the soul of Britain? Your answer was conclusive, and I have been privileged to see an entire people give the reply to tyranny that their history demanded of them.